I was on mute. Are you able to unmute yourself, David? Hello, everyone. Welcome to CripChat, your weekly podcast on everything disability. Today, with us, we have a very special guest, Patrick McGee, disability and justice advocate. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Evie. Thank you for having me.
How's everything going?
Everything's going fine.
Awesome. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. So, Patrick, let's get into it. Tell us a bit about yourself and why you decided to become an advocate.
So I've always been, ever since I was 18, working with people with intellectual disabilities, and so in all sorts of different ways, supporting them in their houses, supporting them in the community, and then finally advocating for them. I have a bit of a natural talent for advocacy, and this led me to become a guardian at the Office of the Public Advocate for many years here in Melbourne. During that time, I became involved with a young Aboriginal lad, and he was from an Aranda lad, and I'll call him Win Marty. And he and I worked together for many years, and all of those different things, different experiences, led me to this point where I became a national systems advocate, particularly focusing on people with disabilities in the justice system, and particularly working with First Nations communities in the Northern Territory.
Interesting. Amazing work you do, Patrick, in the advocacy space. Patrick, can you describe the difference between systemic and individual advocacy, and how different, what different roles have shaped your approach to advocacy?
Thank you for that question. It's a good question. I mean, from my point of view, individual advocacy is standing beside a person with a disability and empowering them to overcome a barrier which enables their world to become better. So, for example, individual advocacy might be that I attend a police station with a person with an intellectual disability when they're being interviewed by the police. Systems advocacy is where you take the cumulative experiences of people with disability in a particular aspect of their lived experience, like a barrier that they're experiencing collectively, and you seek to change the cause of that barrier, so that in fact, what you do is prevent the barrier from being there in the first place. So if I continue with my previous example where, people with disabilities are supported when they're interacting or being interviewed by the police, a systems approach to that barrier might be where police standing orders require that whenever a person with an intellectual disability is being interviewed by the police, they have access to a support person, and that this requirement is independently funded. And that way, you don't have to do it on a case-by-case basis. You just collectively remove the barrier to support people attending police interviews with people with cognitive impairments like intellectual disability. I suppose that one of the things that led me to understand, or one of the roles that has shaped my approach to advocacy, has been my role as guardian. And I'm guardian for two Aboriginal people up in the Northern Territory, both involved in the criminal justice system, and both very complex, complex needs. As their guardian, it's become very clear to me that the best approach to advocacy, or one of the best approaches, and there are lots of different types, but one of the best approaches is where you support people to make their own decisions. And in supporting people to make their own decisions, you're empowering them to make choices and to implement those choices in their lives. And so supported decision making, which is out of Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is about equality before the law, is a really important mechanism by which we can empower people.
Nice. From your point of view, which one's, I guess, the better approach towards advocacy? Systemic or individual?
Both are equally as important as the other. And in fact, one leads to the other. So they're they're interlinked, I think. The way we understand that there is a systems problem, like access to justice is a systems problem. We know that people with disabilities do not enjoy the same access to justice as, say, people without disabilities. The way we understand that that's a systems problem is because we know that many, many people come to request support on an individual basis around access to justice issues. And so around the country, in every state and territory, we know that lots of people with disabilities ask for help to access justice, to access their justice rights. And so that leads us to understand that there are systems problems, systems barriers all through the justice process for people with disabilities. And so one leads to the other, and when you fix the systems problem, you fix some of the individual circumstances that people with disabilities face when trying to access justice.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing, Patrick. Next question. So you have led a national civil society campaign to dementia and replace the indefinite detention of people with cognitive impairments. So can you tell us the story of what campaign and why it was so important?
It's a great question, and thank you for that. I have known a young Aranda man. His name's been Marty. That's the chap I was talking about before. For 24 years now, I've worked with him on his community in the Northern Territory when he was 9. When he was 17, he killed his uncle on community, and that meant that he went to jail. Now, along the way, what happened was that he was declared before the courts mentally impaired, that is, that he had an intellectual disability, and that he was unfit to plead. That is, that because he had an intellectual disability, he couldn't understand the difference between right and wrong, and so he couldn't plead guilty or innocent before the court for the crime of killing his uncle. That process leads people in this country to be indefinitely detained. That is, detained for the purposes of treatment, because we can't have the community have the right to live safely, and people who are a risk of harm to others, like my friend Win Marty, they need to be detained in order to receive treatment to address that behaviour that causes the risk of harm to others. And he was someone who he used violence as the mechanism by which he expressed complex emotions like anger, like rage, like humiliation, like shame, and he was unable to articulate those complex emotions, and so he used violence to portray them, to express them. And this made other people unsafe. And so I became his guardian, because his detention occurred in a maximum security prison in the Northern Territory, and where really, really terrible things happened to him. There was a lot of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of this young man whilst he was detained. And so, in understanding his journey of indefinite detention, I began to look around, and I saw that in this country there are over 1,200 people who either have a mental illness or some type of cognitive impairment, who are indefinitely detained, that is, detained without an end date to that detention, who are detained in this country every year. And that detention is often arbitrary. It's arbitrary because it is based on their disability and it has no end date, and where they are very, very vulnerable to cruel, degrading and inhumane treatment. And so I suppose in advocating, in being the individual advocate and the systems advocate for my friend Win Marty to dismantle and replace indefinite detention, I began to speak out nationally about why we needed to dismantle and replace indefinite detention in this country, and that led me to become a Churchill fellow. And in 2022, I went around the world and looked at how countries around the world, in the United States and England and Sweden, all addressed this issue of people who are a risk of harm to others, who commit crimes, and what those other countries did.
Thank you for sharing that, Patrick.
Really.
Sorry to hear that. It's important that you advocate for these people. Start advocating for change. So leading up to the Royal Commission, do you think the media has become more interested in illuminating advocacy issues generally, and the issues of people with disability in the justice system specifically?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I had a long think about this. I think that society generally is more interested now in hearing the stories of people with disabilities, and I think that and that comes about because we've been on this journey of inclusion, which began with deinstitutionalisation, and most recently we've had the implementation of the NDIS and the Disability Royal Commission, and along the way we've had the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So there is this journey that we're all going through, which began where people were hidden away from, people with disabilities were hidden away and not included. This journey of inclusion where I think now the media is more interested in the stories of people with disabilities. And I think also that that sometimes means that they're more interested, or that they're interested in hearing the justice stories of people with disabilities. And in the area that I work in, which is people with disabilities being detained in places of detention around the country, the most recent example of this was the Four Corners report into the forensic detention system of people with disabilities in this country, which was aired last October in 2023. And so that was, Four Corners did this big investigation into people with disabilities being indefinitely detained. And that was a really big moment, really, for people with disabilities in this space. And what they did particularly well was that they told the story of the person with a disability from their perspective. Instead of interviewing people like me, what they did was, tell the story from the perspective of the person with a disability. And I think that's what's changed the most, is that the media have understood that the best person to tell the story of their own life is the person with a disability. Does that make sense to you?
So the role of lived experience is central to getting to the depth of the story.
I agree, Jonathan. It's absolutely central. I know that when I talk to politicians, if I talk to politicians, they're interested for a little bit, and then they're not so interested, because they listen to people like me talk all the time. But if a person with a disability is sitting in front of them telling their story, then I see them be very, very interested in that story and very interested in engaging with the person with the disability. And I think that there is more power in people with disabilities telling their own stories. And I think that my job is to help people with disabilities in the justice system come before the cameras, or come to be in touch with journalists, so that story can be told by them.
No, it all makes sense, Patrick. No, good stuff. Good stuff. Can you tell us about some positive experiences or examples that are changing how people with disability are treated by the justice system?
Look, luckily we have a few examples of how people with disability are treated by the justice system. I mean, a good example comes from Synapse, which is a brain injury organisation led by Jennifer Cullen in Queensland. And they have created this screening tool called the Goody Way screen. And the Goody Way screen is, and I'm just going to go to my notes so I can make sure I'm saying this properly. The Goody Way screen identifies cognitive impairments in people and their needs, but within a culturally informed process. So up until now, when you've been a First Nations person with a disability, with a cognitive impairment, the screening and assessment tools that help people understand how cognitively impaired you are, where your cognition levels sit, have been white-based assessment tools. And so they haven't always been a good fit if you're a First Nations person with a cognitive impairment. Synapse, working with Aboriginal organisations and disability organisations all around the country, have identified and created this new screen that is much more culturally framed. That is, it asks questions that are relevant to the lived experience of a person with a cognitive impairment, a First Nations person. So an example of that, of how that gets used, is in the Murray Court in Queensland, in Brisbane and Richlands. They use the Goody Way screening tool for convicted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that helps the magistrate understand the person's capacity and then how the court can support them better through that Murray Court process. And the Murray Court is an Indigenous specific court in Brisbane. Now, since the Goody Way screen has been used by the court, 71% of participants in the Murray Court were flagged with impairments in at least one cognitive domain. And what I mean by that is domains that affect their social interaction or their self-management or their ability to learn. So that's a really large number of people, First Nations people with cognitive, that were identified as having a cognitive impairment, and that allowed the court to better tailor the court process so that people were able to participate and understood what was happening. Do you have any questions about that? Because that's a really important step. This idea that First Nations people should have screening tools that are relevant to their First Nations lived experience. For sure. The second area I would just say is with the NDIS. So we've got a big problem in this country, of course, that there are too many people with cognitive impairments in our jails. And the problem has been that, when someone commits a crime, they've got to have a consequence, and the consequence has been that they go to jail. But we know that going to jail for people with, say, intellectual disabilities or acquired brain injury, it doesn't serve the same purpose as if when I commit a crime and am arrested for that and I go to jail. I understand that I've done the wrong thing and I've gone to jail because that's my punishment. So the NDIS has developed people with expertise, planners with expertise, and people with disabilities in the criminal justice system. And these people, these expert planners, are able to create plans, funded plans, that help people with disabilities who might be in detention transition out of detention and into support into the community, so that we can continue to support them and make sure that they're safe and that the community's safe, but that they don't necessarily have to be in jail to understand that, and receive that support. And this is a very big change for the NDIS, because up until recently, the NDIS said, if you're in prison, we can't help you. But now we understand that it's better for people with disabilities who go to prison to be out of prison as quickly as possible and into support into the community. And the people who are helping that process happen are they're called justice planners, and they have a real lot of expertise in creating plans that help that transition process happen. And this is a big change for the NDIS and a really good thing that they're doing.
Do you have any views about the First respond by police towards people with disability. Is there room in the Australian disability strategy for more education and training?
It is really clear, and Professor Leanne Dowes and Simone Rowe from UNSW did a really big report for the Disability Royal Commission on police attitudes and interactions with the police by people with disabilities. And it's pretty clear that in a lot of different ways, that the experiences of people with disabilities when they came in contact with the police weren't great. And this is an access to justice issue, right? Because the police operate under legislation and everybody knows their rights when they interact with the police. But generally speaking, people with disabilities have a less positive experience when they interact with the police. So I think that the police in many states and territories understand that they've got to do better when it comes to the way that they interact with people with disabilities. I think it's fair to say that everybody understands that that journey is just beginning. There is a lot of work to do, not just about the way the attitudes and values that police have about people with disabilities, but the simple justice, but making sure that when they do interact with people with disabilities, that they respect the justice rights of people with disabilities, like they have to respect the justice rights of me when they interact with me if I've done the wrong thing. I think that there's a long way to go, and the Royal Commission was really clear about, as you say, education and training being one aspect that the police need to do better at. But I think also another way that they need to do better at is working with other agencies in the community, so that they're not just the only ones who have to interact with people with disabilities. That they're partnering with mental health agencies, with homelessness services, with disability support services, with the courts, with lawyers, so that everybody does a better, not just be satisfied with an experience of justice that is less for people with disabilities than it is for people without disabilities.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Patrick. Awesome. Finally, given that this Disability Royal Commission devoted an entire volume on disability and justice, what disability and justice issues are most important to you?
So in November 2022, the United Nations Committee for the Convention Against Torture reviewed Australia's compliance with the Convention Against Torture. Now, the Convention Against Torture is one of those big human rights treaties that everybody, that a lot of countries are signatory to, including Australia. And that review found that people with disabilities were experiencing cruel, degrading and inhuman treatment in Australia's places of detention. Now, I'm paraphrasing a lot of words in the what are called the concluding observations, but essentially the committee was a bit worried about the experiences of people with disabilities in Australia's places of detention. We know by talking to, I work with a number of women with disabilities, particularly First Nations women with disabilities, both mental illness and cognitive impairments and physical disabilities. And they have all told us the same things, that when they've gone to jail, terrible things happen to them. In the most extreme cases, like my friend Win Marty, when he was detained in a maximum security prison and he would bang his head against the wall because he was frustrated and upset and confused and scared, the guards would come in, pick him up, tie him down into a restraint chair, and they would have tie his wrists and his neck and his waist and his ankles to a restraint chair. And then they would inject him with a tranquilizer until he was unconscious to stop him from banging his head. That type of treatment, the Convention Against Torture Committee, they call that cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And there are so many examples now in the Banksia Hill Youth Detention Facility in Western Australia, in the Forensic Detention Facility in Queensland, at the Forensic Mental Health Facility in Sydney. There are multiple examples of people with disabilities experiencing cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment. And so I think that one of the most important issues that we need to address in this country, and we can use what's called the OPCAT process, which is where we get independent monitoring of Australia's places of detention. One of the most important things that we have to address is the fact that people with disabilities, when they are in detention, experience cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment.
Very interesting. Thank you for that, Patrick. Jonathan, do you have anything you want to add?
David, do you have any questions?
It's look, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, Patrick, and talk about, your, I guess, work in the space advocating for people, especially First Nations people, and we always encourage you to come back and, give us updated on these issues.
Well,
Thank you very much once again, Patrick. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
It's
For everyone else, if you want your group chat, you're working podcast over disability. Join us next week as we talk about more things related to disability. Goodbye for now.